I've always been in touch with the supernatural, ever since I was a baby. My mother told me that I saw, heard, and knew things I shouldn't have. But when I got older, I started to repress this side of me, always trying to explain it using science, but sometimes there are things not even science can explain. From the time I was 13 to 17, I lived in a house on the countryside of Sweden. The house and what happened there deserves its own story. We lived right by a lake. We had a dock and some old boats we found abandoned by a small beach near our home. During the summer, people would go boating and fishing. This lake roughly translates to long grave in English. It's rumored by the locals that back in the day, they used to dump bodies into the lake. I've tried researching this, but found no written document of this ever happening, so it's hard to say if it's true. There's a half island where we live, a pretty big one, covered in dense forest. This is where I and many others have experienced many strange events. The forest is divided in two parts, each with its own trail. That forks from the dirt parking lot. There's a field that divides the two parts. It was sort of like a shallow bog, and there's a big dead tree that stands alone. There's the right side of the forest, where many would walk along the trail and go to the cape, which was deep in the forest. My brother and I would often play and do kid stuff on the right side of the forest, but both of us have witnessed strange things happening there. One of these instances is when we were deep in the forest around late autumn. We were just exploring and fighting with sticks when all of a sudden, a man wearing a simple button-up shirt and brown suit pants walked straight up out of the bushes. Naturally, we were startled, but greeted the man politely. Now, what I found strange was that he walked really stiff and had a blank expression on his face. The clothes he was wearing weren't weather appropriate, since it was cold. When we greeted him, he only just stood there looking at us, and without saying a word, he walked stiffly in a straight line into the thick tree line. Now, this incident is one of the more explainable and tame events that happened in the forest, but nothing compares to the horror I experienced on the left side of that forest. The left side was rarely visited by anyone. It was mountainous and dense with trees and other vegetation. Prior to this experience, I had never visited that part of the forest. This happened when I was 15. It was January of 2017, and it had recently snowed. It was a cold winter morning, and I was bored out of my mind. I decided to take a walk into the forest with the dog we had at the time. His name was Coda, and he was a Shar-Pei. Not the prettiest dog, and a bit of an asshole, but I loved him nonetheless. I put the leash on him, and we set off towards the forest. We get to the fork, and usually we would walk on the right side. I let him off his leash, and he'd run around sticking relatively close by as I walked, but on that day, I wanted to explore the left side. It was like I had never known about the left side until that moment, and curiosity and a sense of adventure set me off on that path. Walking along the edge of the field until the path leads up to the forest itself was just fine. We just walked along that path, climbing over a fallen tree, and then downwards until we entered a clearing. I unleashed Coda, and he runs like a maniac, as he would often do. The first thing I noticed was 4 oaks in a perfect square. I even took some pictures of it. Past the oaks, there are some young trees on the right side of the far end of the clearing. If I remember correctly, they were birch trees. Then there were tire tracks that led into the forest to the left. How a car could even get in there is beyond a mystery to me, but I followed them anyway since the trail had ended. As I walk into the tree line where the tires were heading, I notice an archway formed by a fallen tree. As I walk along this road, there was a fallen hunting tower. It was covered in moss and seemed to have been there for a very long time. I keep going, and eventually I end up at the shoreline, and there I sat for a while, reading a book as Coda was just doing dog stuff. After a while, I noticed it was getting late, and since it was winter, I had a bit over 1 hour of daylight left. Since it was only a 15-minute walk out of the forest, and I was pretty relaxed, I would make it home way before sunset. So I called for Coda and we set off. This is when it happened. We walked the same way we came. Coda was walking ahead, as he normally would. Getting closer to the clearing, Coda makes it there before me. As soon as he entered the clearing, he took a sharp right behind a tree and completely vanished. I was stunned. I got to the clearing, and as soon as I enter, it was like the world was put on mute. No wind, no birds, no nothing. Only the sound of my breathing. It had started to snow as well. I walked further into the clearing, and all of a sudden I was overwhelmed with a feeling of dread. Like my whole entire body was setting off alarms. I called for my dog, and usually, not always, but usually he comes right away. But now, there was no sign of him. At this point, my body was in panic mode. I needed to leave. My brain was screaming for me to run, but I couldn't go anywhere without Coda. Then I felt eyes all over me, coming from all around me. I felt like I was being watched by 1,000 eyes. I noticed it was getting dark far too quickly. Every second it was getting darker and darker. I was standing there, too afraid to move, crying and desperately calling for my dog. I was there for 7 minutes, and every second felt like a lifetime. And then I heard the loud snap of a branch. I look in the direction it was coming from, and that's when I saw it. Just standing in the tree line, far from where I was standing. It was only for a second, but that image is still burned into my mind to this day. It was huge, easily over 7 feet tall, and covered in the darkest black fur. It had the body of a moose, really long, thick front legs and shorter hind legs. The head was of a predatory animal. I'd never seen anything like it before. It looked like that photographed picture of a horse with a dog's mouth. It was the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen. The eyes are what I remember most, though. It was like looking into the embers of a fire. There was just so much hatred in those eyes. Even if I only saw it for a second, like a flash, I still saw its eyes, and I can still see them even when I close my eyes, like when you stare at a lamp or the sun. I thought this was the end. Time stood still, or at least that's what it felt like. And then moments later, Coda comes from the tree line to my right. He walked right up to me and sat next to me. He never did that. I put the leash on him, and we both bolt the hell out of there. It was really dark at this point, and I could barely see what was going on. The feeling of terror was also added with the feeling of, if I stop, I will die. I ran through the forest on the trail, practically jumping over the fallen tree, and ran down the hill. As soon as I got out of the forest, the feeling of terror stopped. I caught my breath in the dirt parking lot, and noticed the sound of the wind again. The sky seemed to be significantly lighter, too. I felt safe. A complete opposite of how I felt while I was in that forest. I went home and ate dinner, and didn't say a word about what just happened. A few months later, I asked my mom about the left side, if she ever went up there. She's a medium, so she feels bad energies and stuff like that. She told me she stays away from the left side. She feels very dark, bad energies coming from there. That's when I knew that what I experienced wasn't just a figment of my imagination. So why am I telling you this now? Well, my brother and I were talking about that place, recalling childhood memories. That's when he told me his scariest experience in that forest. He told me that he was on a walk to the right side, far in on the trail. He saw a deer leg placed half in a tall bush next to the trail. He said he remembers it was fresh because blood was still dripping off of this leg. He thought it was gross and kept on walking, thinking no little of it. He walks to the cape and started walking back. That's when his body felt tense, and he felt like he was being watched. He picks up the pace until he got to where the deer leg was. That's when he noticed the leg was gone. It had only been 20 minutes since he was last there. That's when he knew he had to leave. Now, this could have been some messed up hunter playing a prank on us, but he doesn't recall hearing a gunshot since the leg was fresh. It couldn't have been a wild animal since the half island isn't big enough for wolves or even bears to live up north. When he told me that, I knew that it had to be the same entity that I saw. There's definitely something wrong with that place. I know as long as I live, I'm never stepping foot in those woods again. I've been trying to figure out what this thing was. It's definitely corporeal. Maybe a wendigo or something along those lines. If anyone has any other clues or would shed some insight, it would be greatly appreciated. Hi, Supernaturalist. I've been listening to your show since you first started, and it's taken me almost a year to decide whether or not I should send you my own story. I decided that it's time to tell my encounter to the world. Of course, there are some conditions to agreeing to send it to you. I want to keep my real name private. I have shared it with you just so you can look me up on Facebook and see that I am who I say I am. We've been friends there for a long time. Secondly, I can tell you that this happened in New Mexico, but I cannot, under any circumstances, tell you where this happened. It's private land, and considered somewhat sacred to a lot of people around me, including some of my family, and I wasn't exactly supposed to be there to begin with. Hopefully, none of the people in my life will figure out who I am, since we're keeping it pretty anonymous. This happened to me last summer, during a trip with my buddy. You can just call him John, for the sake of the story. We went out on a camping trip, just the two of us, to the land we weren't supposed to go on. The belief among some of the people around here is you need to ask for permission from some spirit or the land itself, or something like that. I never really believed in it myself, so we definitely didn't ask permission from anyone physical or spiritual before we went to the land. We were going to stay there for a couple of days, but ended up leaving the very next day. All the crazy shit we experienced made me not want to stay there any longer than I had to. It started off fine. We just threw back some beers, ate some chicken that we had brought, and bullshitted with each other for the first few hours. We made a campfire before it got dark, set up a tent, and just kept bullshitting. When it was around 2 or 3 in the morning, we ended up calling it a night and both crawled into the same tent, which was one of those little 4-person tents. I had dozed off before John, apparently, and he was the one to wake me up. It was still pitch black out when he woke me up. He was whispering to me, kind of scared-like. He said someone was outside yelling. I didn't hear anything at first, but I kept quiet so I could hear, and sure enough, I heard a woman's voice saying, "Hello? Hello? Is anyone there?" I thought we were busted for sure, so we kept quiet, thinking that it might actually be someone trying to draw us out and find us. John whispered to me that we were going to be in deep shit. Then the voice started up again, but it sounded completely different than the first time. It sounded deeper and more forceful. "Hello, where are you? I know you're out here." This was proof to me that someone knew we were there and wanted us to come out. But still, we stayed in our tent. Then, the weirdest part happened. I heard my brother calling me. My own brother. I knew it wasn't him because he wasn't even in town, and he sure as hell didn't know where we were. He kept calling my name, but there was something about the voice that just sent chills down my spine. It was like it wasn't human. It was like all the different ways my brother sounded were stripped away, and whatever was using his voice didn't know how to act like him. Just copy his voice. We started hearing what sounded to me like shuffling noises outside of our tent, but it sounded big to me, like human-sized big. I was on the verge of losing my cool and running for all I was worth, but I knew I wouldn't get very far in the dark. The voices picked up quickly after that. It was like they were sounding off from every direction, and all in different voices. Someone called both our names. Someone asked where we were. Some would ask what we were doing there. It almost sounded like that TV show Lost, when they hear the whispering all around them, but these weren't whispers. They were loud voices. John asked me what we were going to do, and I told him we weren't leaving the tent. For whatever reason, they didn't seem to be coming in, and I knew they were right outside. Then, we heard this screaming noise. It was the most inhuman, primal scream I have ever heard. But it didn't sound like an animal scream either, if that makes sense to you. Now, we were really scared. I definitely wasn't taking my chances of running from whatever the hell was out there. I had a big buck knife, and John had a pistol. If anything were to rip open the tent, at least we'd have a chance to fight. After that, it escalated. Whatever it was started doing this thing, where it would run up and slap the tent. It would hit it 3 or 4 times, very quickly. It was towards the top of the tent, and to me, it would only make sense that it was using its hands to do it, because right after that, you could hear it running off. It was damn quick, too. No human could move that fast in that kind of darkness. The terrain out there was like a big desert. There were rocks and shrubs all over the place. Whatever it was could maneuver in these conditions with no problem at all. John started praying, talking to Virgin Mary and all sorts of stuff. I just sat there, concentrating on the noises, ready to protect myself when they finally ripped open the tent. Then more voices started calling into the night. I swear, as I'm typing this to you right now, that I heard my mom's voice. And my dad's, too. John swears the same thing. He heard his family calling to him, too. If you think all of this is scary, you couldn't even imagine how scary it was when that thing screamed right outside of our tent. I mean, it sounded like the only thing that was between us was the wall of the tent and a couple of inches. It was literally right outside. It slapped the tent again, and this time it didn't retreat. It sounded like it was there, just breathing hard and growling at us, waiting for us to come out, expecting us to come out. And I think it was pissed off that we weren't. I have never even been close to as scared as I was right then, ever in my entire life. I honestly thought I was going to pee my pants. I thought we were done for sure. This thing started walking around the tent again, making heavy footsteps and growling at us. Trust me, this thing didn't sound human in the slightest. It sounded like something evil, like it wanted to scare us to death. Then it started making this laughing noise, but the voice was raspy, like a dry whisper or something like that. And that went on for what felt like forever. Then, it must have took off again because we heard it making that shuffling noise again. We were sitting there, whispering about making a break for the truck, but John refused. He thought it was just hiding or staying quiet to make us think that it left, so we'd get out. Like I said, for whatever reason, it didn't rip our tent open to get us. Maybe it wasn't allowed to or something. Like a vampire needs to be invited in. I don't know. We sat there in the dark, like idiots, trying to figure out what to do until it was too late, and we heard that running, shuffling noise coming up on us again. Honestly, that's the point where I was the most scared. I just had the feeling that this time it was coming in after us. It let another one of those primal screams loose again, and this time it beat the hell out of the tent, slapping it like crazy. I started yelling. John started yelling. We were telling it to leave us alone, to get the hell away from us, yelling out prayers, calling it names, anything we could think of, but it didn't seem to work. This thing just kept running around the tent, slapping it and making all these horrible noises. Some of them sounded like grunts. Some sounded like human words. Others sounded like when a mountain lion screams. It was terror and chaos all rolled into one effed up night. Then, it was like 1 second it was going crazy, and the next it was somewhere else, because everything went quiet, but this single, inhuman voice. Like it was talking with its throat or something. And it said, "You don't belong here. You don't belong here." I couldn't keep the yells of fear in at that point, and I started yelling again for it to leave us alone. I told it we'd leave if it would let us, and that we would never come back, but it ran up and started slapping the tent again and making this angry grunting noise. John yelled out that he was going to start shooting, but I told him he was an idiot. He wasn't shooting the gun without being able to see what it was. He fired back that there was some kind of monster outside, but I still wouldn't let him shoot. That thing out there started yelling, "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" But it was in my voice. My own frigging voice. It was unmistakable. This whole thing was just pure insanity. I didn't even know how to react. I was shaking so hard I could actually hear myself vibrating. I could hear tears in John's voice every time he talked or yelled. Sometimes our voices even got caught in our throats because we were so terrified. I don't even know how to describe how scary all of this was. And then it all just stopped. It screamed again, ran away again, and never came back. It was probably another hour, maybe an hour and a half, that we sat there in darkness, praying out loud, trying hard not to break down. And then, finally, it started getting a little lighter outside of the tent. But still, we just sat there. I could finally make out John's form. I saw him clutching his gun. My first impression was that he looked almost out of it. Honestly, I think we were both in shock. I wanted to just get the hell out of there now, especially since we could see. When it was light enough, and this thing hadn't been there for a couple of hours, we slowly got out of the tent and looked around all sides to make sure that it wasn't there. All of our stuff was gone. Everything we left outside was just gone. The coolers we brought, the little grill, even our shoes. We grabbed everything we could while John was looking around with his gun and stuffed everything into the truck before we got the hell out of there. We didn't even take the tent. Neither of us said one single word the whole way back, and didn't even talk to each other after that for a couple of days. Like I said earlier, I couldn't exactly tell anyone what happened or where I was, but there was one person I knew I could tell, and he would keep it a secret. My grandpa, on my mom's side. I had a feeling he would know more about it, so I drove to his house and told him everything. He was really shocked that we went there. Not mad or disappointed, just shocked that we could be so dumb after we grew up knowing not to go there. He told me what we encountered was probably a skinwalker, and we were lucky to be alive. I'll never, ever, ever go back to that spot. Not ever. I don't even like the dark anymore. Even when I'm home with my dogs and my girlfriend, with all the doors locked and the lights on, I still don't like the dark. Monsters are real. This all happened to me about 5 years ago. It was a night a few of my friends decided after a night of hanging out that we should go on an adventure at about 3 a.m. We took a ride about 50 miles to this old Spanish ruin in New Mexico. It was once the seat of an Inquisition. I can't for the life of me remember what this place was called though. But anyway, we jumped the front gate to this place and started exploring. One of my friends brought a flute with him and started playing it. I honestly don't know why, but he just started playing this damn flute. About 30 seconds into his playing though, something started screaming really, really loud. It sounded like it was going from wall to wall, really quick, and the whole while it was screaming, it was the most blood-curdling scream that you could ever imagine. Honestly, I have difficulty even describing this thing other than being terrifying. Needless to say, we got the hell out of there and drove for a few hours to where we planned to camp for the rest of the weekend. We got there at probably 6 or 7 a.m. and set up our camp. We spent the next few hours talking about what happened to us at those ruins. After a while, I got up to pee and walked off about 300 feet or so. As I'm peeing, I look up and see two of my friends motioning for me to follow them. And this is where my memory gets a little fuzzy. I remember it felt like I was being pulled behind them, and like I had shackles on or something. And I followed them for what seemed like 10 or 15 minutes. And then I snapped out of it and realized that these things weren't my friends. They were these creatures that looked horribly mad. They had bright red hair, but my friends' faces, and cat eyes. These things stopped walking and looked at me with the most terrifying expression I've ever seen. Now, I've seen monster movies all my life. There's nothing that compares to what I saw. As I snapped out of it, I realized that I was in extreme danger, and I finally was able to turn around and ran as fast as I could. The way I came was about 5 minutes away from our tent, actually. Whatever it was that was causing me to feel that fog must have diluted my sense of time or something too, because I got back there in 5 minutes at a full sprint. I passed the rock that I stopped to pee on and found our camp. Everyone was still sitting around talking and hadn't even noticed that I was gone. I told them what happened. I told them I thought I saw a skinwalker. Luckily, they all believed me. We packed everything up and left probably within 10 minutes. And we went all the way back to Albuquerque. We've never been back since then. I don't know what the hell it was that I actually saw, but since it's New Mexico, I just figure that it's a skinwalker. I guess it could be something else, but around here, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it's probably some kind of skinwalker that wants to eat your flesh or steal your soul or whatever it is that they want you for. I don't know if it was the flute that had that thing follow us, or if those creatures were just happening to be in the forest that we were camping in. Either way, I'll never go back to either of those spots. I've always believed in the paranormal. I've had enough run-ins with spirits in my lifetime to answer the questions of whether or not these types of things actually exist. The encounter I want to tell you about, though, is not because of a spirit. I believe what I encountered that night was a skinwalker, or at least something along the lines like a wendigo, a fleshgate, or a crawler. This happened to me in Colorado in 2002, when I was only 8 years old. Even then, though, I had the sense to stay indoors and not go poking around to find answers that could end up with me being eaten or snatched away. We had a really big backyard then, and a big deck on the back door. Our yard butted up against a big forest area, and it was just miles and miles of trees and woods behind it. It was actually pretty cool growing up there, but when the sun went down, things could get a little spooky, especially as a young kid. Sometimes there would be unexplained screaming noises that didn't sound quite human enough to be human, and not animal enough to be animal. Maybe it was something in between. I was accustomed to a lot of wildlife coming through our yard. Deer mostly, but sometimes other things like bear and mountain lions. We were always careful to be aware of our surroundings out there. I think that's why I had enough sense to stay inside, even as little of a kid as I was. I knew things out there could hurt me. The night in question started off like any other night. The animals outside were making a racket like they always did. Sometimes the bugs got so loud you could hear them through closed windows. I always found that more comforting than annoying, to be honest. It wasn't until after I went to bed that everything changed. I remember waking up to the sound of something making a soft tapping noise on my window. My window faced the woods and was next to the living room that was connected to the backyard and patio. At first, I thought I just remembered a noise from my dream, but I realized when I was fully awake that the noise was here in reality. I was scared from the get-go. I'd already been exposed to spirit activity at my grandparents' house, and those noises immediately reminded me of those occurrences. I just stayed in my bed and listened to the tapping with my covers pulled up over my eyes. I wanted to get up and run to my older brother's room for comfort, since he was just in the next room over, but something in my brain told me to stay put. That's when I started to see the shadow of something moving back and forth at my window. At first, I thought it was just the shadow of one of the trees because it was standing so still, but when it moved, I could see the silhouette of this thing. It was taller than I thought a person should be, and very skinny, emaciated like. It didn't appear to have clothes on, but I only ever saw the shadow of this thing. I knew it wasn't anything I could identify though, because it appeared to be standing on two legs. I could see the arms moving as it moved back and forth at the window. Then I saw one of the arms move up to the glass, and heard the tapping noise again. This was followed by a voice calling out to me, asking me to come outside. I knew the voice. It was my dad. But I knew the shape of this thing wasn't my dad. He was a lot shorter, and there was no reason he would be outside this late, waking me up and asking me to come outside. Still, his voice came from the window outside. David, come out here. I need you to come to me. I could hear it plain as day, because it was like all the other sounds outside were muted. This thing's voice was the only noise coming from outside. But there was something wrong with the voice too. Like it was a recording, or lacking any type of emotion. Like whatever that thing was, knew my name and knew how to speak, but it didn't know how to express itself. No type of human emotion. Everything about it was just wrong. I stayed put, breaking out in a cold sweat and shaking violently from fear. Eventually, this thing moved away from the window, but I could still hear it outside, calling my name. It sounded like it was moving down the house towards the backyard. I was terrified that it was going to try to get in the back door, and I said a short prayer that my parents had made sure to lock the door before they went to bed. Somehow, I managed to pull myself out of bed and quietly leave my room. I needed to make sure it wasn't getting in. When my brother grabbed me and literally put his hand over my mouth to stifle my scream, I almost died from fright right there in my pajamas. He shushed me and told me that I wasn't going outside under any circumstances. Well, duh, that's not why I was getting out of bed. I was really relieved to know my brother was not only awake, but on my side, and he heard the thing out there too. He squinted at me in the little light that was in the hallway and said, "That's not Dad." I told him I thought it was going to try to get in through the back door, and he went into the living room as quietly as possible. We could both see the shadow of the thing as it moved past the window in the living room. Then it started tapping on the glass of the back door and calling out to me again. I was on the verge of tears. It never tried to jiggle the handle of the door though. It just called to me a few more times until it made its way back towards my room. We could follow it as it passed by the windows. Then, the damnedest thing happened, and I swear, as sure as I sit here writing this out to you, the damn thing's voice changed to my mother's voice, and it tried luring me out again. My brother and I looked at each other. That was our breaking point. We bolted to our parents' room and flipped on the lights, yelling to them to wake up and trying to convince them about what was going on. They were both asleep in their bed. Neither of them were outside. Of course they were pissed at first, but we were frantically trying to talk over each other until my dad yelled at us to calm down and talk one at a time. My brother went first and told them what he had heard. I backed up his story. They both looked at each other, unsure of how to act. I mean, I don't really blame them. What exactly are you supposed to do when your kids wake you up at 2 o'clock in the morning yelling about something outside that was stealing your voice? We ended up staying in the room for the night, and my parents had gone out to see if someone was trying to prank us. Even though I was in tears, begging them not to, they still went out just to make sure. I swear, them being outside was even scarier than seeing and hearing that thing out there. Whatever it was never came back. I slept in my brother's room for almost a month because I was afraid to sleep alone. But still, we never encountered that thing again. I think we either scared it off when we ran to my parents, or it gave up because it knew it was useless to try to get me out there. Either way, I'm glad to have never encountered it again. We moved away from there about 10 years after that, when I graduated from high school. I hope it never comes back and torments the family that's there now. I don't know what it was, but there are several things out there that can mimic human speech, even if they don't get the emotions right. My suggestion is, though, if you hear someone calling your name in the middle of the night, don't go outside to investigate, unless you're sure that it's really that person. This happened to me and my best friend, and I'm still scared to talk about it. I didn't believe in any of this stuff until I witnessed it myself and started doing a lot of research on the paranormal. Honestly, if my friend Steve wasn't there to witness this too, I would chalk it up to my own imagination, or a hallucination, or something else along those lines, but we both saw it. That proves to me that this happened. I'll start off with a basic rundown of who we are. I'll call myself Sam, and refer to my friend as Steve. These are not our real names. We're both 21 and live in Oregon. I'm not really comfortable telling you which part this is, but this thing happened in Willamette State Forest here in our state. We're both college students. We work hard and we get good grades. We're both down-to-earth people. Steve believed in all of this before we had our sighting because he used to live in a house that he said had a ghost in it. I always gave him a hard time for believing in it, but I guess I ate my words after that night. We had gone on a weekend camping trip and had planned on having a third person join our trip, but he bailed out at the last minute, so it was just the two of us. We arrived Friday around 11 a.m. and had set up our campsite with no issues. We went to collect firewood for the fire we'd make later and went on a short hike. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at all. We sat around the fire, having a few beers and talking about school and our plans afterwards. We had both chosen the path of radiology, and we talked about where we'd likely end up after we graduated. Again, nothing was out of the ordinary. That is, until we got into our tent. We had just settled into a 4-person tent when everything went dead silent. It was chilling, and actually gave me goosebumps. It was like the whole forest just suddenly stopped talking and was watching from their hiding spots. We both sat up, trying to look around, but of course we were out in the middle of a forest. There was no light at all. We sat there for a good long while, breathing quietly and waiting to hear the noise of something walking around, but nothing happened. And eventually the noises of the forest returned. It was a very welcome return. To me, that said whatever predator was out there had vacated the area. I looked at my watch. It was a little after 1:30 in the morning. We both started whispering to each other about what it could have been. I just figured it was something like a lynx, but Steve thought otherwise. I told him that I hoped that he wasn't right, that it wasn't a bear or a pack of wolves. He assured me that they'd be more afraid of us than we would be of it, but when you're out in the middle of the forest and it's pitch black here, it's still not a very comforting thought. Eventually, we both fell asleep, and I assumed nothing else happened. We woke up in the morning, almost feeling silly for being scared. It's a lot easier to be brave in the daylight, where you can see everything, right? We looked around for prints from anything that could have visited us in the middle of the night, but we didn't find anything. The rest of the day was, again, normal, and we just went about our day, having fun and enjoying the forest. I was still on the lookout for anything that could have caused the forest to go silent, though. I wasn't keen on getting attacked by a pack of wolves or mauled to death by a bear. We saw nothing of the sort, though, and after a few hours, we returned to our campsite after another hike. I have to add that we didn't see another person out there the entire time we were hiking. It was like we were the only ones on Earth. Only 2 people in the whole forest. Night fell, and we again sat by the fire eating our dinner and enjoying the break from civilization. We were just getting ready to open a bottle of Jack when we heard what sounded to me like a scream. It stopped us dead in our tracks. We started looking around for the source, but it did sound very far away from us. I thought it sounded human. Steve agreed with me. I wondered if it was just another camping party goofing around, and we waited to hear it again. 10 minutes or so went by without any more screams, but then we heard plain as day a human woman's voice calling for help. We stood, trying to find the direction that the voice was coming from. If someone needed our help, we weren't going to ignore them. It was dark at this point, the same darkness where we couldn't see anything the night before when our visitor made its presence known. I figured maybe somebody got lost and was calling for help. We took out our lantern and flashlights, and Steve started heading in the direction that the voice was coming from. I decided to follow, as I didn't want to stay at my campsite alone, because that feeling of creepiness was washing over me again. And then we heard the scream again, and it confirmed we were in fact going in the right direction. Steve called out to the woman, trying to get her to talk to us. We needed to know where she was, and if she kept talking to us, we'd continue in the right direction. She called out several more times asking for help, saying she was lost and telling us she needed help. Those 3 sentences were all she ever spoke, even though she repeated them a few times each. I need help. I'm lost. Can you please help me? Every time she called out to us, it sounded like we were getting closer, but something seemed off. We both felt it. Something wasn't right about this situation. When she did call out to us, it always sounded the same, like it was a recording of a woman asking for help. It was the exact same pitch, same verbiage, same vocalization every single time. I asked Steve if we should keep going. He didn't want to take the chance of having this woman get hurt if we turned back. I admired his desire to help, but I was also creeped the hell out at this point. Either way, I didn't want to get separated from him in the middle of the forest, so if he wasn't heading back, then neither was I. We got to this little clearing and stopped, calling out to her again, and when she responded, it sounded like she was right on top of us, but she was still yelling in the same tone. I realized then that the forest was silent again. I pointed it out to Steve, and I actually heard the air get caught in his throat. How stupid were we? We followed a voice out into the middle of the forest in pitch black darkness. All I could think was how foolish we were. We had fallen into its trap. And then the growling started. It didn't sound like a canine or a bear. It sounded unnatural. And it sounded big. Steve started to panic and was shining the flashlight beam around wildly. He didn't need to shine the beam at those eyes for us to see them. I'll never forget them. They illuminated themselves. They were this piercing, glowing, bright green. It really reminded me of a light stick, but it was definitely a pair of eyes. The growling intensified, and we turned to run. Luckily, it was a pretty easy navigation to get back to where we were, but it was still a good distance away. As we ran back in sheer panic, we were yelling and hollering. We kept turning back because you could hear whatever this thing was chasing us, but I never saw anything behind us. I could definitely hear it though. As we were running, that thing started repeating the cries for help again. It was definitely that thing that lured us out there. The scariest part though, as we were running and yelling at each other, it started mimicking our voices too. It was saying the same thing it did in the woman's voice, but now in our own voices. I almost had a heart attack right there in the woods when I heard my own voice crying out for help. When we reached our camp, we had planned to run directly to the car, hop in and get the hell out of there. And that's exactly what we did. Thank God, Steve had the keys in his pocket so he wouldn't lose them. We sped the hell out of there and back to civilization before the sun came up. We pulled over to the side of the road and tried to talk about what had happened. What the hell did we just witness? But we were both at a loss for words. We had no idea what it could have been. A couple of days went by. We hadn't actually talked. I think we were both in a state of shock, to be honest. When we did talk again, we naturally went to the elephant in the room and started talking about what it could have been. Neither of us had a clue. I told him all I saw were the eyes, but they were the eyes of something not a lot of people would believe to exist, i.e., it wasn't some native species. Steve told me he saw the eyes too, but he also caught a glimpse of the face when he was shining the light around. He told me all he was able to see was a small part of the side of its face, but that's all he needed to verify that it was something supernatural. He told me the thing had no hair on its face where he could see it, and that it was a very, very pale white color, almost like the color of snow. Honestly, it was that pale. That's the only part of the creature that Steve saw that I can verify for myself, but I believe he saw what he saw. We ended up going back for our stuff during the day. I don't think it hunts during the day. I think it's nocturnal. Either way, we packed our stuff and collapsed our tent as quickly as possible and then got out of there again. We were on edge the whole time we were there, but as we packed up our stuff, we tried to look around as best as possible for any signs that this thing had been there. Other than a very potent smell of ozone, there wasn't anything else we could find that would be considered odd. There were no tracks, no broken tree limbs, nothing like that. All our stuff was intact. Nothing was missing, no claw marks on the tent or around the trees. We strained our ears as much as possible too, just in case we heard anything unnatural like that night. But there was nothing there. I ended up doing a lot of research on what it could have been, now that I'm a believer, and I have two possibilities still. A fleshgate or a wendigo. I think it's too far north to be a skinwalker. It might even be in the wrong area for a wendigo, but we are up north and those things do like the woods. The fact that it can mimic human speech is the most terrifying thought about it though. I wonder how many people it's lured to their deaths because of that. I wonder how many of these missing people that disappear in the forest without a trace are because of things like the creature that we saw. I haven't gone back there since. Neither has Steve. I don't think we'll ever be so eager to go into the woods again. Something is out there in the forest. Probably all the forests of the world. And they have the capability of human speech. At least to the point where it can mimic us. It's smart enough to use calls for help to lure people away from the safety of their campfires too. And that's all I have to say about that. What do you think this is? What is this nighttime dwelling, mimicking predator with glowing green eyes? I have an experience that I would like to share with you. This happened when I was 14 years old, and now I'm 29. This experience is something I will only share with a small number of people, and until now, I have never written it down for anybody to read. My brother, who was a hardened soldier, still is scared about what happened to us that evening. Granted, he was only 9 years old at the time, but the memory still haunts us both. As teenagers, we would visit my grandma at her home on the Navajo Nation for several weeks at a time, and we would do this every summer. I would love to spend time with her, eat anything that she was willing to cook for us since she was such a great cook, and listen to all of her crazy stories. Every so often, my grandma would hire a worker. usually the harmless town drunk, to do jobs around her house and property. One evening, right before the sun went down, I was asked by her to take him home. It was about 4 miles out of the valley where she lived, and I was more than happy to do it because I was only 14 years old at the time, and being asked to drive a truck was pretty damn awesome. Mind you, on the reservation, no one really cares that you're 14 years old and driving around, and there's hardly anybody to see you doing it anyways. So my 9-year-old brother jumps in the truck with me, and the worker and my dog shared the tailgate of the truck. After I dropped the worker off at the shack that he and his brother called their house, we headed back down the road to our grandma's. As I mentioned before, it was evening, and the sky was this beautiful deep red color as the sun began to set. We were leaving a nice dust trail on the road behind us, and the radio was playing music on the only station that could be picked up from the nearest town. It was perfect. There was nothing unusual, nothing weird, at first. And it was at this time that I caught movement of something in the bushes a little up the road to the right of us. I remember slowing down and thinking it could have been one of the many free-roaming sheep in the area that usually would dart out in front of the truck. As I passed where it was, though, I didn't see anything, so I sped up, thinking nothing else of it. Then out of nowhere, I just felt this dark feeling of fear and dread. I had no idea why I was feeling this way, but I definitely felt that something was wrong. And to top it off, my brother was getting quite scared and emotional as well, and starting to cry. As I play this memory back in my mind, there's only a few clear moments that I have of that evening. I clearly remember looking in my rearview mirror and seeing the dark silhouette of something very tall and very skinny that seemed to be covered in some kind of fur, running behind us, and it was moving fast, chasing our truck. Whatever it wasn't a normal human, and I don't think it was even human at all. I remember hearing my brother crying, and the dog barking ferociously at whatever this thing was that was giving us chase. I remember speeding up, going very fast, and shaking violently as the truck bounced on the dirt road. I don't know if I was shaking because of the truck or the fear. And I distinctively remember that this thing was only getting closer, and my brother was crying out, "It's coming up on your side." I remember being scared as hell and thinking that I didn't want to die, and I didn't want my little brother to lose his life either. But at that moment, the only thing I could think was these would be our last minutes together. I remember speeding around a bend in the road and seeing a car coming towards us in the opposite direction. And it was at that moment that I felt this instant relief and felt that whatever it was that was chasing us was gone. I don't know if the other car had scared it off or if it gave up. Maybe it even started chasing the other car. I don't know. All I know is we were shaken up, but alive, and we made it back to our grandma's house, wondering what the hell just happened to us. We ran inside, not looking back, slamming the door and locking it, hoping that whatever it was that was chasing us didn't follow us home. We told my grandma about our experience, and to our surprise, she didn't seem too surprised by it. That just confused the hell out of us. She continued by repeating stories we'd already heard, and at one point, she told us another about black magic, witches, and what the Navajo call a skinwalker. Needless to say, I didn't want to look out any of the windows around the house the rest of the night, and as a matter of fact, I never even drove on the reservation at night until I was 21 years old after that. Without going too deep into explanation, I'll say that these skinwalkers are believed to be evil men and spirits that use black magic for evil doing. I tell you that as far-fetched as it might sound, they are very real. I 100% believe that. If God and his infinite greatness are real, then the devil is equally as real and has ways of showing himself. And I think this skinwalker is one of those ways. This might not seem scary to some people, but what happened that evening really did happen to us. It scared the shit out of us. I invite anyone to visit Arizona if you have any doubt or want a huge scare. I promise you, you won't be disappointed. This happened to us in September of 2018, but the memory is still fresh in my mind, and it's also still completely terrifying to me. Whatever we saw, I still don't really know what it was. What I do know is that it wasn't a person, and it wasn't an animal. Maybe it was something in between. Maybe it was something else entirely. We were in the Roosevelt National Forest on a camping trip in Colorado. So maybe it was a wendigo. I still have no word to describe exactly what it was. My name is Eric, and I was with 3 of my friends, Aaron, JR, and Jonathan. We were going on the last camping trip of the season. We wanted one more good camp out before we had to pack up for the fall and wait until the spring to go camping again. We were drinking all night and telling stories. Basically just having fun and messing around like 4 buddies that have known each other their entire lives do when they get together. It was about 1 a.m. when we heard this weird whistling sound. The whistle was almost human. It changed in pitch, and it had a long, drawn-out volume. All 4 of us heard it. It was 3 or 4 times, and it sounded different every single time, like it was doing a different tune or a different pitch. We just thought somebody else was out in the woods dicking with us, so we yelled out for them to get lost or they'd have a problem, and then we went on drinking and having fun. When we heard it again, JR stood up and yelled out if anybody was out there, they needed to make themselves known because we had our firearms with us. That's when we noticed that the forest was eerily calm and quiet. Just a little while ago, all the night bugs and the owls and all kinds of shit were making all kinds of noise, but now, nothing was even making a peep. The whistling started again, and at this point, we're more annoyed than we were worried. I mean, there's 4 of us. 4 big dudes that were ready to throw down whenever we needed to, and we all had each other's backs, so nobody out there was going to scare us. We just drank some more and kept talking until Jonathan got up to go to the bathroom. He came back though, after he heard some movement in the trees in front of him while he was taking a leak. If any of us were worried, it would have been him, because he's usually the one that lets his imagination run wild, so when he heard the noises, he zipped up and came right back over to us. About another hour or so, which would put us at 2:30 in the morning, we decided to pack up and go to bed. I shared a tent with Aaron, while JR and Jonathan slept in the tent next to us. I don't know how long later it was, but I woke up and Aaron was already awake too, because we heard the same damn whistling again. This time though, it sounded like it was right outside. The air felt like static electricity or something. It was like the air was charged with energy. I whispered to Aaron that some strange shit was definitely going on out there, but all he whispered back was, "Yeah." I think he was freaked out at this point. The whistling eventually stopped, and after a while, we both went back to sleep. Morning came the next day, and we had breakfast over an open fire, and we told JR and Jonathan what we heard the night before. We asked them if they heard anything, but neither of them did. That didn't surprise me because both of them are very hard sleepers. After that, we all went looking for firewood in different directions, and here's where my memory isn't actually that good. I was walking through the forest for probably less than 5 minutes or so when I saw JR motioning to me to be quiet and follow him. I shrugged and went with him, thinking that maybe he was going to point out some kind of wildlife, or maybe we got really lucky and we were going to see a couple of girls out in bikinis or something. Yeah, wishful thinking. So I went with him, and I don't actually know how long I walked. I was like in a trance or something. I started asking him questions like where we were going or what we were walking to, but there was no answer. He seemed off, too. Like, he moved different than JR did. Like, he was uncomfortable walking or something like that, if that makes any sense at all. Just like, as un-JR as he could possibly be. We walked a little while longer until I got annoyed. I grabbed his shoulder to try to get his attention because I wanted some answers. He twitched and jerked away from me. When he flinched, he turned to look at me with this look of pure evil, and he actually hissed at me like some kind of animal. I saw his eyes. They were not the color of JR's eyes. JR has brown eyes. The eyes I saw were this bright greenish yellow, like the original flavor of Gatorade. It was like they were glowing or something, almost like the same type of glow that Wolf did from the Neverending Story. That's when I snapped out of it, and all at once I realized how stupid I was. JR had gone off the complete opposite direction of me. How could he have gotten past me on the trail? All of a sudden, fear hit me out of nowhere. It was the worst fear I've ever felt in my entire life. Pure panic set in, and I turned around and just started to run, hoping that I was running in the right direction. Then, that's when I heard my friends shouting. I heard all three of them calling my name. It was a long distance away, but it was in the direction that I was running towards. And that feeling of dread and danger just completely overtook me. I was sweating. I felt like I wanted to vomit. I knew that something wasn't right. Whatever it was that was pretending to be JR ran off in the other direction. I ran for several minutes, full speed, dodging trees, jumping over fallen logs, almost tripping on a couple of them. I finally caught up with my friends, who were in the middle of the forest with their guns drawn, yelling for me to find them. I told them we needed to get the hell out of there. We needed to leave because something was in the forest and it wanted to kill us. For whatever reason, they didn't argue. Maybe they were just as freaked out as I was. Maybe they saw something too. At that moment, I didn't give a damn. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. We ran back to camp, threw everything that we could into the truck, and got the hell out of there as fast as we could. Later, when we were talking about what happened, I learned that all three of them were calling for me for more than 10 minutes. I never heard any of them, and we weren't even that far away from each other. It was like whatever this thing was that was leading me away from them had me in some kind of trance. I don't know what it wanted. I'm glad I never found out, because I doubt that it wanted to give me a hug or something like that. It probably wanted to eat me. Whatever this thing was, after I snapped out of that trance, I could feel the evil rolling off of it in waves. None of the other three saw it, but they did hear the whistling again, and all three of them heard some kind of whispering, although none of them could make out what it was. But it was enough to freak them all out, and they had their guns drawn. I've never gone back into that forest, and in fact, anything that we left there is probably still out there. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a wendigo. It could have been a fleshgate, or a crawler. All these things that you're mentioning to me in these emails. There's so many things out there now that I'm learning exist. I have a hard time figuring out just what it was that I encountered. And hopefully somebody on this channel will be able to shed some light on what it was that I saw. We don't really talk about it much. I guess it brings up memories we don't want to talk about. When we do talk about it though, we all tend to agree that it was trying to lure us into the woods, and I just happened to be the first one that it tried to prey on. I've read some stuff about these things, and some of the lore says that when they make themselves look like other people, they can mimic their appearance and their voice, but not their personality or demeanor. I think that's why it looked so weird when it was walking and pretending to be my friend. Be careful out there, guys. Fear the woods. There's things out there that you wouldn't believe exist.